Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 8. This is the final chapter of our memory unit. So it's kind of a culmination of chapters 6 and 7, and I know this probably doesn't need to be said, but if you haven't watched those videos, if you haven't read those chapters, this is not a great place to start. Check back with those other things before you check back on this one. So really what we're going to be doing in this, because remembering complex events, that's the name of the chapter, but it's really kind of nebulous. It's kind of abstract. What does it mean? Basically, what we're going to be covering in this chapter is we're going to look at how memory interacts with other kinds of cognitive processes, basically. So we're going to look at how memory and emotion interact, and how emotion can both help and hurt our ability to remember things. We're going to be talking about how situations and schemas are able to help and hurt our memory, and we will also be talking about false memories. So a pretty good breadth of coverage in terms of what we're going to be covering. With that being said, we're not going to go into too much detail about each of these subjects. If we wanted to, we could probably make, I'm not going to say a whole class out of some of these things, but you could make a whole research career out of some of these things. So there's a lot of depth here. We're just mostly going to look at this from a broad point of view. The video that I have here at the very beginning is by a man named Stephen Wiltshire. You may have seen some of his videos on the internet before. Basically, he is a man who has autism spectrum disorder, and kind of his claim to popularity, the reason why people know him, is because for the first several years of his life, he was nonverbal, so he did not have spoken language communication skills. But what developed in that absence turned out to be an incredible gift for art. Specifically, kind of the thing that he showcases on TV and on YouTube is his ability to, basically, you can put him in a helicopter, fly him over a city, and he will be able to remember all the streets, all the windows to the buildings, where each building is facing, and he can draw it all out from memory from just a simple 30-minute helicopter ride. It's remarkable. So check this video out to check that out. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how he's able to remember that, but basically some of those pieces you'll kind of glean through this chapter, but without too much of a tangent. Basically what happens is that because he grew up without really strong verbal abilities, he compensated and had very strong visual capabilities. So basically, the quote-unquote voice in his head is less of a voice and more of a canvas. He thinks in images. He thinks in icons and imagery and visual details. He doesn't think in in a voice like most of us do. All right, so that's Stephen Wiltshire. Check him out. It's very, very interesting and very impressive. All right, so let's get into emotion and memory. We ended off chapter 7 kind of just about coming into this, because we were talking about the amygdala, and we were talking about, if I recall correctly, about how different mood states can affect what we remember. And so you may remember a graph that looked very similar to this. We were talking about how our emotional context greatly impacts what we remember. So to simplify that, essentially, that whenever we are happy, we remember other happy events. When we are sad, we remember other sad events. And that is exactly what this figure here on the right shows, is that basically you have the types of memories that are recalled. You have positive, neutral, and negative, and then you have the kinds of moods that they were elicited. So basically they came in, and then the researchers assigned them a mood by making them watch certain either really sad scenes from movies or really happy scenes from movies. And just like we talked about last chapter, whenever people were in happy moods, they were able to remember positive items. When people were in sad moods, they were more likely to remember sad items. So that kind of emotional context is important. That emotional context is going to change what types of things we remember, what types of things we are able to retrieve, because that emotional context acts as a retrieval cue. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at this now, because an interesting thing in the research has been shown for decades now. And the question is whether or not emotions can enhance memory. So, oftentimes this has a negative connotation, right? That we remember the things that really hurt us. That's what a lot of people mean whenever they say, that emotions enhance memory. And so we will be talking about that a little bit, but we're also just talking about just emotions in general. So positive emotions, negative emotions. Do emotions enhance our memory? And so oftentimes what we hear, and we'll talk about this more later in the semester, is if I were to ask you about your favorite movie, or if I were to ask you about your favorite book, and you were to tell me about it, usually the things that resonate most with you, that you remember the most, are the emotional things. Maybe what characters did to one another, or what happened to a character, or a prominent character death, or an act of heroism. These types of things that give us an emotion we tend to remember. So stories like that, the emotional component is what seems to be remembered more. So why is that? How could that be? Part of that is because that emotional material is going to make that story more salient. In other words, it makes it more vivid. And we talked about how vividness is something that can help memory. The other thing is that it's also going to give that material importance. So if you are reading a book and a character that you really love, something happens to them, that character is now important to you, right? You're invested in it. And so because of that, it's encoded at a deeper level too. So you can think about the levels of processing that we talked about how whenever you think about what something means and how it relates to what you already know, that it's encoded at a deeper level. So to illustrate this, some researchers did a really cool, fascinating study where they took a story and they manipulated the emotional component of that story. So before I get into that, I'll give the content warning in just a moment. It's not coming yet. So here is the example. So in this example, the first part of this experiment is completely neutral. You have people, they come in and they're watching this slideshow and they're having a narration about what's going on. So here you can see in this picture, you see looks like two people by a door, and the information that the participants are given, that all of them are given, is a mother and her son are leaving home in the morning. She's taking him to visit his father's workplace. The father is the chief laboratory technician at a nearby hospital, and they check before crossing a busy road. Okay, so this mostly does not have really any emotions with it, right? Like, it's pretty unremarkable. And here's where things are going to take a twist. The researchers then assigned half of the people that watched this into a dramatic condition, and the other half stayed in the control condition. So you're going to have some people that have emotional content and some people that do not have emotional content. So let's look at what happens. Before I move on, I'm just going to say that some of the images here might be a little graphic. I don't think that they're really anything worse than what you'd see on TV, but just letting you know that for the next 60 seconds, that's what we're going to be looking at. So, both in these stories now, you're going to see two different narratives. Here in the red, we're going to have the emotional narrative. Here in the black, we're going to have the non-emotional, the control narrative. So for the emotional narrative, we have while crossing the road, the boy is struck by a runaway car, which critically injures him. In the neutral condition, we have while walking along, they pass the scene of a minor accident, which the boy finds interesting. In the emotional condition, the next step is going to be at the hospital. The staff prepares the emergency room to which the boy is rushed. For the neutral condition, at the hospital, the staff are preparing for a practice drill, which the boy will watch. And so again, they're seeing all the same images. What's different now is the context in which they are seeing those images. In the emotional condition, all morning long, surgeons struggle to save the boy's life. And then over here, in the neutral condition, all morning long, surgeons practice the standard disaster drill procedures. And then finally, in the emotional condition, specialized surgeons were able to successfully reattach the boy's severed feet. And then in the neutral condition, special makeup artists were able to create realistic-looking injuries on actors for the drill. All right, and so then after that, both groups then got the same condition again, which is just neutral. So these final three images all have the same non-emotional story. So after a while, the father stayed with the boy. The mother left to phone her other child's preschool. She phones the preschool to tell them she will soon pick up her child. Heading to pick up her child, she hails a taxi at the number 9 bus stop. Okay, so that's the story. Now, after this, participants then got a little bit of a delay, and then they were given a pop quiz on this particular story and what they remembered about it. I know that some of this is dated because this specific article was published a long time ago. It's very influential, but it's kind of old. And so whenever I teach this in a classroom setting, I usually use updated images that I find, which is why if you scroll down to the very bottom of this PowerPoint series, you will see the new kind of not super dated images that I use, in case you are wondering what that looks like. All right, so here are the results of that. So in the results here, you can see both the 3 phases. We have the non-emotional beginning, the non-emotional ending, and then we have the middle, where some people got an emotional story and some people got a neutral story. So let's look at that first. This is the most important piece, is that whenever people have the emotional story, they seem to remember much more than whenever they have the neutral story. So whenever people were just given, and again, they're given the same images, the only thing that's different is what those images stand for and what they mean. So here what we're seeing is that basically having that emotional content does indeed enhance memory. Like, it actually does make people remember it better. Even though they're getting all the same information, it's just that this information is now emotional. If we were to look back at the 2 different neutral phases, though, at the beginning, at the end, you see maybe a little bit of an advantage for the emotional story, but honestly, those effect sizes are so small that I don't know if I would really trust them as being all that important. And so if you wanted to, you could probably say that having this middle part of the emotional story makes the entire story more memorable, but that seems to be kind of stretching the data a little bit too much. For the most part, whenever it's neutral, it's the same. For the most part, I don't see error bars on here, and so I can't tell you if they are, in fact, statistically different or not. All right, so why does this happen? Essentially because whenever we have these emotional events, it activates the amygdala, and it could be that whenever the amygdala is activated, it is going to result in better memory consolidation. So part of that is going to be the effects of the amygdala, but it also could be just because whenever we are emotionally stimulated, our attention narrows, and because it narrows, maybe we have better encoding for that reason. It also could be because whenever we have emotional events, we tend to dwell on them and think about them more, so we also rehearse them more. There are lots of different reasons why we might have higher or increased memory for these emotional events. All right, now the next thing that I want to talk about is also a little bit, not controversial, but upsetting. So flashbulb memories are something that you have probably experienced before, but maybe you didn't have a name for it. Maybe you didn't know what it was called. What a flashbulb memory is, and if you are having a really bad day and you don't want to talk about serious stuff like world events that were traumatic and dramatic, and even things that happened right down the road, maybe from where you live, that were dramatic and tragic, maybe skip on to the next video and come back to this whenever you're more in the mood to handle that kind of thing, because flashbulb memories are almost always having to do with sad memories and depressing memories and bad things that have happened to people. So in the classroom, I will usually ask folks, what do you remember from the Sandy Hook shooting? Now, some of you are going to be super young when this happened. It happened several years ago by now, but it happened kind of close by, right? It happened in Newtown in Connecticut. I might be better off asking, where were you whenever you heard the news about the Boston bombing, the Boston Marathon bombing? Back when I first started teaching, I was able to use the example of September 11th, but by this point, most people who are in my classes actually weren't born during September 11th, which is weird for me to think about, because I feel like I remember exactly where I was during September 11th. I feel like I remember exactly where I was when I heard news about the Boston Marathon bombing, and I lived in Alabama at the time. That was far away. I wasn't as close as you probably were when that happened. So for these big, large-scale national tragedies, we all kind of feel like we remember exactly where we were and what we were doing. And so for these really emotionally salient events, we feel like we can recall those events perfectly, and that's why these are called flashbulb memories, because it is as if a flashbulb went off and took a picture of everything in the surrounding, and that you can recall that information perfectly clear. So that's why they're called flashbulb memories. And like I said, you've probably experienced something like this before. So where does that come from? A lot of research in the past 10, 15 years suggests that maybe flashbulb memories are not what we think that they are. That it's not actually that these really intensely negative events lead us to have perfect memories, but that maybe maybe the story is a little bit more complicated than that. What this research shows is that our confidence in those memories is really high, but the actual memory itself is susceptible to the same methods of forgetting and losing those memories as any other kind of everyday event. Generally, they are better than most memories, but they're definitely not perfect. They are still susceptible to interference and decay. So like other memories, these flashbulb memories are going to fade with time. They are going to be susceptible to misremembering things and things of that nature. But again, we feel very confident in that information. So these types of very vivid events, whether they be positive, whether they be negative, they tend to stick out to us, and we feel like we are really good at remembering them. So these really vivid episodic memories are really vivid, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are more accurate. They're just as susceptible to misattribution and interference as other types of memory, but this is really hard to study in the laboratory. And if you are thinking ahead, you probably understand why, because it's really hard, for one, to find a tragedy that everyone has experienced, and also how to verify that that person's initial memory is accurate. So, for example, if I told you about my experience, about where I was during September 11th, you don't really know if I'm being accurate. I could be misremembering this stuff. For me, I feel like I thought that I was in the 7th grade. I thought that I was going to Mrs. Durance's class, which was in a different part of the middle school, and her door was, and it's an English class, and her door was open, and she was standing outside, and as we were walking to her door, she told us to go in and be quiet. And I remember going in and sitting down and looking up at the TV, which is in the top left-hand corner of the room, and feeling like I didn't understand what was going on. I thought it was fake for a while, and I remember, and I can go into more details, but all these things that I'm telling you, it sounds probably believable because I can give you details. I remember she was wearing a light green shirt or a light green blouse, but I could be wrong about that stuff, right? There's no way to really check on that stuff. So if I'm a researcher interested in accuracy for these types of memories, what the hell am I supposed to do, right? So these things are really hard to study in the laboratory for lots of reasons. And so usually whenever people study this stuff in the laboratory, usually they are going to look for these big national tragedies. They're not going to look for specific personal things, like getting into a car wreck, for example. That might be something that you have a flashbulb memory of, but here they're going to go for these big, broad things. So you will see in the literature, in research, you're going to find people talking about September 11th and asking people about their memories for September 11th. You're also going to see the Boston Marathon bombing. You're going to see Sandy Hook. You're going to see, before that, the Challenger space shuttle explosion. Before that, you'll see Some people even talking about as far back as Pearl Harbor and also the JFK assassination. All these things are big things that everybody would be aware of. So for this specific study that you're looking at right here, what they were looking at is they were interviewed shortly after the September 11th attacks, and then 1 year later they were re-interviewed again, and then they basically keep on every couple of years. They bring these folks in and they re-interview them. And so even though they can't really speak to the accuracy of this initial memory, they can look to see how much the subsequent memories match up with that initial one. So whenever I interview you again a year from now, I can check to see exactly how closely your memory is to where your initial memory was. So based on all of that, roughly a third of people gave a substantially different account of what happened, but they were super confident that this was true. You can see the confidence rating over here in this right panel, where over here on the right you have a 5. That is perfect confidence. You have so many people being perfectly confident in their memory, but what we find here in the left panel is going to be the accuracy. So the accuracy for their first memory, and we see most people have an accuracy of 0. That is how bad their memory was for that event. But the thing is, we're so confident in that because it is a very vivid emotional reaction that we have when we think about those things, that it skews our ability to judge with any kind of neutrality or being unbiased how accurate we actually are. Alright, so that's all that I want to talk about for this video. We're going to be talking next video about how schemas and situations affect our memory and vice versa. See you there.